All right, this story again and again. Shokin was fired by Joe Biden, and with these new release of these Hunter Biden emails, it brings into question Joe Biden's original story that they fired Victor Shokin because of this international sort of uh, consensus that Victor Shokin was a corrupt prosecutor and he had to go because what Victoria Nuland was saying that he wasn't prosecuting Burisma, whereas email I'm showing right now, I'm going to read right now, kind of says that he was looking at the Burisma case and that maybe that Joe Biden had different sort of motives. That he wanted to fire Victor Shokin because he was investigating this firm that was hiring his son, and that Burisma was pushing Hunter Biden to work with his dad to get this prosecutor fired that was investigating. So I'm going to read this. What we got from these new email batches is that one of the employees of or executives of Burisma wrote to Hunter Biden and Devin Archer, his business partner, on November 2015. And what he said was he basically implied that he needs deliverables and he needs named people from the United States to work with because, and I quote, um, let's see, U.S. policymakers to Ukraine in November aiming to conduct meetings and bring positive signal message and support Nikolai's issue to the Ukrainian top officials about the ultimate purpose to close down her cases pursuit against Nikolai in Ukraine. And that's Nikolai Zlochevsky, the CEO of Burisma. And this is Vadim Pozarsky, who is a executive in Burisma. And he's basically saying that the purpose of his relationship with Hunter Biden is to get these cases closed down, which Victor Shokin was pursuing, which Victoria Nuland was basically saying at the same time that he wasn't pursuing. So joining me now, we have again Steve McIntyre and Hans Menke. Steve, do you want to take it from there about Victoria Nuland?
Sure. Yeah, actually, there are a couple of other sentences from the November 2nd Pozarsky memo to Hunter Biden and Devin Archer that are useful or instructive. In the first paragraph, he Blue Star had, who are a firm of Democrat fixers, including Bill Clinton's former chief of staff, had been requested by Hunter Biden to work out a public relations strategy for Burisma. And on October the 30th, they sent a proposal via Hunter Biden and Devin Archer to Burisma. And the number two guy at Burisma reverted and objected to as follows. That to the proposal, it says it doesn't offer any names of top U.S. officials here in Ukraine, for example, the U.S. ambassador, or Ukrainian officials, the president of Ukraine, chief of staff, prosecutor general, as key targets for improving Nikolai Zlochevsky's case and his situation in Ukraine. However, if the omission of names, is done deliberately to be on the safe and cautious side, I can understand the rationale. And if all parties, in fact, understand the true purpose of the BS engagement, with the BS being kind of an unintentional pun there, BS would be for Blue Star. The true purpose of the BS engagement and all our joint efforts, it's okay and we should proceed immediately. So right away, they're sort of, he understands that they're not writing down everything to do with their true intentions. And so we have to read these emails with that in context. But the date, the date's interesting because when we looked at this previously, just after the exposure of Eric Chiaramella as the Ukraine, as a whistleblower. There was a real puzzle into sort of when Joe Biden demanded Shokin's resignation and what led up to it and what the crisis was. And the other issue was the fantastic amount of disinformation in U.S. media about Shokin's role in settling the Burisma case. What U.S. media said was that Shokin was that Biden demanded the firing of Shokin because he wasn't pursuing the investigation of corruption aggressively enough, with the Burisma case being the type example offered by the State Department. But it turns out that Shokin was, in fact, pursuing that investigation, and there was evidence that he had, in fact, arrested or frozen assets of Zlochevsky in February 2016, shortly before he was fired. So there was a contradiction in that narrative. And the other big contradiction is that the settlement is that after Shokin was fired, Blue Star Strategies immediately met with his replacement, Lutsenko, and during the subsequent 8 or 9 months, negotiated settlement of all of the outstanding lawsuits involving Zlochevsky in Ukraine, with the final announcement of the resolution of these lawsuits being announced in January 2017, in the last hours of the Obama administration. And then literally hours after the announcement of the settlement of all the Burisma lawsuits in Ukraine, Joe Biden went to Ukraine in literally the last couple of days of the Obama administration, for purposes that remain unclear. So there were lots of mystery. So there's quite a lot of detail before we had the Hunter Biden emails, but the new emails, I think, shed some important new light on it. So this November 2nd email from Burisma, in a sense, expressing great frustration with Hunter at the lack of progress in making the Burisma cases disappear, is at total contradiction to the position of the State Department at the same time, who are demanding Shokin's dismissal on the grounds that he wasn't pursuing the Burisma case vigorously enough. And so we're asked, so one, in trying to resolve this controversy, we can think, well, who would be more familiar with what's actually happening in the Burisma case? The number 2 guy at Burisma, or the U.S. Embassy and Victoria Nuland, based on information from the U.S. Embassy. And my take on it is that the U.S. Embassy was poorly informed about what was going on, that the Burisma executive who was wanting to have the cases formally dismissed was doing so because they were being pursued, contrary to what Victoria Nuland and George Kent and Jeffrey Pyatt were saying. And so that it was live. It was alive in November 2015. It was frustrating Burisma that it was still live, and the way it eventually got settled was by dismissing Shokin and dealing with his successor. So there's lots to dig into here.
Now, this sounds an awful lot like one of these play fakes, doesn't it? Where you've got a problem with the prosecutor, but you make it sound, you turn it on its head. You make it sound as if the prosecutor is not doing what he's supposed to do, and that's why you need to get rid of him. Whereas, in fact, he's actually doing what he's supposed to do. So that really brings us to where did Newland and her people get her information from?
Well, just on that, it would be like Tucker Carlson says, they accuse you of doing the things that they're doing themselves. So
exactly.
If they want to get Shokin fired because he's pursuing it, it's much better to accuse him of not pursuing it.
No, that's exactly right. And Tucker got it from Joseph Goebbels, who used it not in relation to World War II. He actually used it in relation to World War I, because he accused the English of accusing the Germans of what the English were guilty of. So it's a long story. It's been around for a long time, but it's more true than ever right now. So if I recall correctly, Newland got her information from those two guys working with Shokin. So Casco and the Georgian guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, David Sakar Valensky, who are the deputy prosecutor generals who are working underneath Victor Shokin, who might be at odds with Victor Shokin. And that sort of becomes apparent, I would say, eventually in late 2015, when both of them are invited to the White House and Victor Shokin's not, for a January meeting. And Steve, you can go into that.
Yeah, I'll take that, because for my sins, I spent time researching the role of the Georgians and Casco. Just one preface on this. This is one issue that Hans had sort of raised for us in this discussion, was the oddity of the Vice President of the United States intervening in the internal affairs of Ukraine to demand the resignation or dismissal of a prosecutor general. And in my opinion, it goes back to these two deputies and shows the riskiness of trying to micromanage the affairs of another country when you don't know the ins and outs of it. But I can say, just as a Canadian, to comment on from an American perspective, you may not think that it seems all that odd for Biden to go and tell the Ukrainians to dismiss their prosecutor general, but if
I think it's pretty odd.
well, if they just even if they did it in Canada, everybody, regardless of which, even if they wanted the prosecutor general dismissed in Canada, the mere fact that it was demanded by Mike Pence or Donald Trump, or even if it had been Obama or Biden in the previous administration, everybody would be unified in objecting to the interference. And so there's a element in which the Ukrainians could authentically object to being ordered around by the U.S. Embassy, and I perceive a strong element of that in the reactions of Shokin and his associates, that when they're being told that there's an element that they may well have been protecting crookedness, but there's also an element of them saying, well, we're Ukrainians, we have our own system, and we don't want to be ordered around by Joe Biden. And so there's several strands to that. Anyway, the Georgians. This is a really weird chapter in the whole story. In February 2014, there was what can only be described as a regime change coup in Ukraine, in which U.S.-backed political parties drove out Yanukovych, the then unpopular president. But there are lots of presidents and prime ministers that are unpopular, and they don't all get driven out by violent demonstrations. The riots in Kiev in February are a worse version of the Portland riots and New York riots. And while these were going on, Obama was telling the Ukraine government, well, you can't intervene to shut down these riots. You have to let the protesters, not protest without doing anything. And what the protesters were doing things like firing acetone-laced Molotov cocktails at the young policemen that were trying to control the demonstrations. And the acetone Molotov cocktails were a horrendous witch's brew that couldn't be put out. So you literally had young policemen being burned to death in these riots. So they were very serious riots. And so a new government came in. Where were
the Georgians?
Oh, the Georgians. Anyway, but Poroshenko gets elected as president, and they promised reform. And one of the odd things he did was he imported Biden becomes the U.S. viceroy in Ukraine, and he had been active in a sort of a similar regime in Georgia 5 years earlier, by Saakashvili, which had been voted out after 4 or 5 years. And so the civil servants and politicians that had been voted out were out of jobs, and in some cases were being investigated by the successor government. Biden brought them up to Ukraine, and they were given senior jobs in the Ukraine government. So Saakashvili became the governor of Odessa. Saakashvili became was one of 5 or 6 deputy prosecutor generals. There was another guy in the Ministry of Health, and so on. Saakashvili, over time, the Ukrainian civil servants were unenthusiastic, to say the least, about the Georgians coming in, and by 2016, all of them were sort of rejected by the Ukrainian bureaucracy and out of government. So Saakashvili, who and Shokin was appointed initially as a deputy prosecutor general in 2014 by Poroshenko coming in. At that time, Shokin was a retired prosecutor, and Poroshenko was coming in, and he had an unknown amount of corruption in the prosecutor's office. Shokin had at that point, an unimpeachable reputation in a sleazy business. He lived modestly. He obviously hadn't bought houses in the French Riviera as other guys had. And so he came in as a deputy prosecutor general in part as a favor to Poroshenko. In late 2014, a amount of $23 million was frozen in April 2014. $23 million of Zlochevsky's money was frozen in London. A couple of weeks later, Zlochevsky hires Hunter Biden and Devon Archer as directors. Zlochevsky had protection in the previous government that had been overthrown and the U.S. regime changed, but he didn't have protection in the new government. In his opening email to Hunter Biden and Devon Archer explaining their jobs, Burisma explained to them that they were being shaken down by the incoming government. And they, in particular, they said that Interior Minister Avakov, who was part of the Yulia Tymoshenko bloc, was shaking them down for money and was making what they described as invalid claims against them. It's impossible to really to plumb the depths of sort of what was legal or what was illegal. You know, Zlochevsky doesn't seem like a particularly savory character, but Yulia Tymoshenko is just as bad. You know, is almost certainly worse. But the difference is that she had protection in the with the U.S. administration. She was a friend of Hillary Clinton's, and one of the conditions that the U.S. had for the new regime which they'd installed was that Yulia Tymoshenko, a crooked oligarch, be released from prison. So sitting, if I were a Ukrainian and trying to decide what, you know, which oligarchs should go to prison and which ones aren't, I mean, they're all crooked, and they all got their assets by sort of appropriating some public, you know, public sector assets for nothing, or some other sleazy thing, but some were protected and some weren't. So Zlochevsky went to Hunter Biden and Devon Archer for protection, and I think I get the sense of a lot of frustration on Burisma's part because Hunter seems to have overpromised and under-delivered in terms of the protection that he could offer. So that, in one sense, the defense of the Bidens to whether they were actually corruptly influencing policy was, in fact, that they were defrauding foreign crooks by promising to affect policy, but then not delivering. And so roll ahead. The London case would require a 1 hour conference on its own to summarize. But the money that was I'll try to do it in 2 minutes because it becomes, you know, it seems in the weeds, but it comes up over and over and over again, and there's an infinite amount of disinformation about it. Zlochevsky had, before Zlochevsky went into the government in sort of 2006, he already had an oil and gas business, and you know, some of it may have been, some of it almost certainly was acquired through shady practices, but he actually did have a business that was producing natural gas and was pretty successful. He had a variety of assets, and so he had money in London, which he said he'd gotten through the sale of an oil terminal. And you know, it's hard to tell how far back it could be traced in terms of the illegality, but and then this oil terminal was sold, and the money was put aside for a deal which didn't happen. The bank in London told them in 2013 that the money wasn't, the original purposes of the deposit didn't seem to be fulfilled, so they wanted him to close the account. So they made arrangements to close the account, and then when they tried to transfer the money out, the British, this was about 2 weeks after the coup, By that time there were sanctions declared on various Ukrainians, and the British prosecutor's office seized or froze the money as possibly illegally, on the basis that it was illicit proceeds of crime. They then, some months later in December, they notified the Ukrainians that it had been seized. And several cases were opened in Ukraine to investigate Zlochevsky's possible crime associated with this, but they hadn't progressed anywhere. And in fact, it's not clear that this particular money actually arose from a crime, or at least not in the or at least from a recent crime. Maybe sort of 10, 15 years earlier there was a crime, but by that time it seemed to be a legitimate. The proceeds were from a sale of a legitimate asset. In December, it came to trial, and they asked the Ukrainian, Zlochevsky's lawyers asked the Ukrainian Prosecutor General for a summary of cases against him. And at that point, Zlochevsky had not received formal notice of, or he hadn't been notified that he was a he hadn't been charged with anything at that point.
A target, I guess.
Yeah, but none of the cases had advanced sufficiently to charge him with anything. So they wrote a letter to the sort of stating that there were no charges pending against Zlochevsky. This went
right.
one.
And you're talking December 2014 or 15?
14.
14, correct. And at this time, Shokin's not even Prosecutor General.
No, Shokin's not in it. But
well, this is a very, I mean, we can not emphasize that point enough, because I've seen a lot of narratives out there where Shokin is meant to have let Zlochevsky skate with the 24 million, and that's just not true because he wasn't the prosecutor at the time.
But even then, sort of this particular letter, the Ukrainians and the U.S. State Department place all the blame for what happened in the court hearing on this letter, which in fact had a very secondary role in the affair. During the investigation, Zlochevsky's lawyers had asked repeatedly for disclosure of relevant documents and exculpatory information, because the original freezing had been on an ex parte application to freeze the funds. So nearly all of our listeners will, I'm sure, are now somewhat knowledgeable about both the importance of ex parte, of full disclosure in ex parte applications, because that was the issue in the Carter Page FISA application, and also the importance of disclosure of exculpatory information, because that's the issue in the Flynn trial. So it's interesting to look at the handling of the British case in connection with Zlochevsky through the prism of the FISA application and the Flynn exculpatory information, because the British judge talks a lot about both of those issues, and the British judge, like a lot of British decisions, is beautifully written and clearly written and concisely written. It's a model of how judgments should be written. Anyway, so Zlochevsky's lawyers had asked for disclosure of exculpatory information. They say there isn't any. They go through 2 days of the 3-day hearing, and again the lawyers ask for it, and they say there isn't any. On the 3rd day of the hearings, they say, well, there are a few documents that we haven't disclosed. So this ends up, so the hearing, I can just picture the hearing ending in sort of polite English chaos. So they disclose the documents, and there are 17 documents that they disclose, nearly sort of the majority of which were highly relevant and highly exculpatory. And so but on that day, what is decided is the prosecution withdrew their original application. They or at least they withdrew their objection to the defense's motion to vacate the original order because of this this complete failure of disclosure and the repeated misrepresentations that they'd made to the court. So, this is what ought to have happened in Flynn's case, but didn't. But they then argued in the alternative that even though they agreed that the old order needed to be vacated, they argued that there was enough information to justify a fresh order, and so they asked the judge to look at the fresh order in light of the new evidence. Now the British judge said, even in the early one, they took and also they took the position that when somebody comes with an ex parte application, that's not a license to investigate. Under British law, they have to have evidence to support the application. So when they were saying that the money was the proceeds of criminal activity, they had to have a basis for saying that. They couldn't just assert that and then begin investigating Zlochevsky. The other deception, the other thing that the court had got mad on, is that in their original application they had stated that as a fact that that the only explanation for these funds was criminal activity, whereas the defense team presented exhaustive documentations about oil terminals and contracts to show how the money approximately arose, and that it had arose from Zlochevsky's actual international business and not through some corruption, or not through at least recent corruption in Ukraine. Anyway, the judge dismissed it all. Like he said, he didn't even call them back for a hearing. He said, I've seen enough. You misled us in the first instance. You didn't have a basis for freezing the money in the first place. You don't have a license to come and tell us false information in the first and then carry out investigations to try to cooper up your false information. And he paid no attention to and by this time, I guess Shokin had, in a last-ditch effort, opened some investigations against Zlochevsky as soon as it came sort of onto his horizon in December, and they disregarded that and said, if Ukraine wants to pursue these, they can, but they were pretty mad at the misrepresentations by the UK prosecutor's office. So, and the reason why that's important is that it's certainly my reading of the case that it fell apart based on the conduct of the UK prosecution, not because of some crookedness in Ukraine.
No, that's my reading of it too. I remember we went through that judgment very carefully. It was probably a year ago or more, when we were all talking about the impeachment, and that case was dismissed clearly because of what the UK prosecution did. That had nothing to do with Shokin or what the Ukrainians did. I mean, short of the Ukrainians just making stuff up and just sending them bundles of made up things. And even then, it might not have gone forward because of the omissions on the UK side. So anyway, the bottom line is to argue that somehow that case was lost or that money was gone because of Shokin is, as we said, he wasn't the prosecutor and all the other things we discussed. So that's just simply not true.
So bring it forward to, I guess, another bench. Now, Shokin.
Well, the two guys, we're trying to figure out what it was. Why is it those two guys, the Georgian guy and Casco, who what could have been their motivation in sort of bad mouthing Shokin to the U.S. side?
Okay, well, they come at Sakvaridze comes in February of 2015. So he comes in just after this the London thing falls apart in January of 2015. Right. Casco had been a deputy prosecutor general starting in 2014. He came on earlier. He's a different generation than Shokin, so he seems to have been an ambitious 40-year-old. Shokin would be 65, something like that, brought out of retirement. Casco clearly wanted to have Shokin's job. And Casco also struck me, it looks to me like he comes from a different part of the country and has different sort of political allegiances than Shokin. Casco comes from Lviv, which is in West Ukraine. It's sort of and there's a strong there's a sort of a seismic fracture in Ukraine between the Ukrainian-speaking half and the Russian-speaking half, and nearly all American commentators sort of assume that Russian-speaking Ukraine is necessarily pro-Russia, and they don't just like. Whereas there's a strong, there's clearly a strong, people in Russian-speaking Ukraine wanted to protect their use of Russian language as a official language, just the way as in Canada, French and English are both official languages, and if English-speaking Canada tried to prevent the use of French as an official language, Quebec would separate in a heartbeat. And there's that same sort of dynamic in Ukraine. And Casco comes in from the sort of most right-wing, sort of Ukrainian right-wing city in Ukraine, whereas Shokin is clearly more of a centrist and would have sort of grown up in a Ukraine where the eastern Ukraine, which is the Russian-speaking sector, was an important part of the country. So there's very complicated politics in that respect. But so I can see a careerist element in Casco trying to undercut Shokin. I can see political differences, and overlaid on that, they all accuse one another of corruption as a tool of any other objection. So I think in Ukraine one has to take accusations with a grain of salt, because they all accuse one another of being corrupt, and they all may well be, but it doesn't. One of them saying so doesn't make it true. So Casco comes in and allies with Sakvaridze, and they both are reporting more or less to the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy gives them money, which is separate from the funding they're getting from Shokin. Just from a management point of view, it looks like a totally corrosive situation where people from an outside, not just simply an outside company, but an outside country, are dealing with junior members of the Prosecutor General's office who have their own ambitions, and ultimately the stories that Casco and the Georgian tell George Kent and the U.S. Embassy, and thus Victoria Nuland, end up becoming embedded in U.S. policy.
No, that's right. Now, so we've got an angle here as to why these two guys might have told the stories they were telling. I think it's a good point to remind ourselves that whatever they were telling and whatever Nuland ended up with as her narrative, as we started off with, doesn't jibe with the fact that Burisma had a totally different read of the situation. So just to go back to where we started off from, Burisma, this is the new email we got on this the new dump. This is the November 2nd, 2015 one, where the second guy at Burisma complains to Hunter that Hunter isn't doing enough in terms of what he was supposed to do for them, and in terms of helping them out. And so Burisma is worried about investigations and having Hunter sort of kill those things off. At the same time, Nuland is saying, we're worried about the lack of investigations. And so she's getting her information from those two guys. So I think that it's very important to trace that disconnect. And I think we've sort of shown that it's more likely that the Burisma guys were rightfully worried about what's in store for them. And later on, I'm not sure where sort of they're getting the storyline, but they actually had assets seized in February of the following year, 2016, and so on. I think we'll get back to that. But I think this is just a very important point, that just because Nuland says something doesn't mean it's so. And I think we've shown. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I just say, I mean, like right now we've got a perfect example of how, like, if we consider people's views on, say, the status of the Durham investigation. Right now, lots of people think, like if you were, sort of picture how, like, let's say that you had the equivalent of a Durham, like, I don't know, first of all, through 2015, it appears to me that there was, some action on under the Shokin administration in respect to the various cases that had been opened in 2014. They weren't in any way dead. I don't think they were moving at lightning speed, but they hadn't been killed either. So if you consider what people think of the Durham investigation right now, where half the U.S. public thinks that nothing's been done, and half of them thinks that something's going to happen. So I would say if you were a target of the Durham investigation, you would certainly be legitimately worried. And on the other hand, if you were somebody wanting to have some news from it, you'd be pretty mad that there isn't any news. So Victoria Nuland is in a way in position of somebody who is mad at the lack of news from the Durham investigation.
No, now, that's right.
And also, I guess a lot of it is, now with the one caveat, is that she was also very poorly informed by at least it appears to me, by George Kent and people in the U.S. Embassy as to what actually happened in the London case, and and in general what was going on. Clearly she was being told by George Kent, and George Kent told this in his Senate testimony, that the London case fell apart because it was sabotaged by 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 the then Prosecutor General and his subordinates. The names were, I can look the names up, but anyway.
No, that's right. But that creates this sort of this frame of mind where it's the corrupt, prosecutor's office, and obviously that was false information.
That comes, okay. So in September 20, well, we'll get to, so after this long preamble, we'll get to, in September 2015, Ambassador Pyatt gave a speech, which is a benchmark in which he was very critical of Shokin, and in particular he referenced the London, what he felt was the mishandling of the London case, with his characterization of the London case being, as you and I read the London decision, a total mischaracterization of it. So, and then what Pyatt wanted Shokin to be doing, the Prosecutor General's office to be doing, was to investigate and charge the deputy prosecutor who had botched the London case. And yet, as I read the London case, it didn't fall apart because of anything that the deputy prosecutor in the Ukrainian side did. It fell apart sort of entirely because of what the UK prosecutors did. And so the Ukrainian prosecutors may have been defective on any number of reasons, or crooked on any number of reasons, but that you really couldn't charge them for how they handled the London case. That they just had it all wrong. The other thing that the Pyatt was mad about was that they were expecting charges for people that had been shot at the Mayday demonstrations or Mayday riots in February 14th. And by this time, a year and a half had passed and nobody had been charged as a sniper in the Mayday shootings. Nobody still, and still to this day, it's not been pursued. There's a Canadian academic that has written articles on this, which argue that the Mayday shootings were in fact false flag by the right-wing factions that overthrew the government, and so there would be, and in fact, one of the leaders of those right-wing factions, Andrei Parube, later then became Minister of Security in the incoming government and met with American and Canadian leaders. So there are a variety of explanations that one can think of why the investigation into the and trying of the shooters hadn't progressed. But if the police, like, that would seem to be more of a police matter than Shokin matter. So blaming Shokin, it wasn't as though there were people that the Ukrainian FBI had brought informations on to be charged. So it does seem a false rap on Shokin that he hadn't tried anybody on the Mayday shootings.
Well, and the other one is the diamond prosecutions that he was blamed for.
Yeah. Okay. And that, and there, Newland's testimony was as deceptive on timing as Papadopoulos's testimony on timing.
More so, even, yeah.
More so, yeah. In July of 2015, and this, I guess by this time, Shokin had been on the job as Prosecutor General for 4 months. Two prosecutors in the Ukrainian equivalent of New Jersey, were arrested, and in their houses were found cash and diamonds worth several $100,000. Now, as we know from Hunter Biden was also found in possession of a diamond, but that doesn't seem to have led Joe Biden to demand his arrest. But in any event, the guys that were found with the two prosecutors were clearly shaking down local businessmen and forcing and extorting money from them, and over time it had been quite a lot of money. They were arrested later and charged while Shokin was Prosecutor General. But nonetheless, Casco and the Georgian complained vehemently that they were being obstructed in their job by Shokin. And that one of the Senate lawyer asked, and Victoria Nuland cited Shokin's obstruction of these two guys as examples of why he needed to be fired. And he asked her, well, how exactly did they block these two guys, since they actually did arrest the prosecutors and charge them? And Nuland said, well, I don't know, but these two guys told us that he was blocking us. So anyway, that's what and then the lawyer moved on. But they don't, I think there's certainly, the incident was unsolicited. The prosecutors were clearly crooked. They're not the only crooked prosecutors. Now, where Nuland's story is also unconvincing. So Nuland had offered up the diamond prosecutors. Let me go back. The Senate lawyer asked Nuland, well, what changed between September 20, Pyatt's speech, and Joe Biden's arrival in demanding the removal of Shokin? What triggered the Biden's demand? The very question that stumps us. And so she said, well, the diamond prosecutors case came up, and that was in the fall, and that showed that not only was Shokin not making any progress, but things were actually getting worse. Just after Pyatt's speech, Shokin had and now where Nuland got the chronology wrong is that the diamond prosecutors affair had been in July, 2 months before Pyatt's speech. So it was already baked in at the time of Pyatt's speech, and it certainly didn't get worse after that to cause things to go apart. In fact, on the contrary, Shokin went to Pyatt 2 weeks after the Pyatt's excoriating speech and said, look, we want to do this right. We'll be happy to take on any U.S. advisors to help us with this case. We want to be fully transparent on this. So he certainly seemed to have put out an olive branch to Pyatt, and so it's hard to understand why at the same time, and then why. So Nuland's characterization of the diamond prosecutor incident as occurring after pious speech and being the straw that broke the camel's back is clearly false. Now, she in fairness to her, she had a very big job and a lot of files, but nonetheless, her recollection on this was wrong, and the information that she gave to the Senate committee was wrong, and it provided a pseudo explanation of something that that wasn't true. The Senate lawyer also asked her, well, how did the recommendation for and she said that the recommendation that Shokin had to go was something that came up through the interagency process before Biden asked for it. And so they asked her, well, what is the interagency process? And she said there would be 3 levels of committee meetings. There would be a meeting. The first would be the sub-agency interagency, and that would be 1 level below her. It would be at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level. Then there would be a principals committee meeting in which she and her peers would be involved. That committee was chaired by Celeste Wallander of the NSC, and then then it would be above her would be the Deputy Secretary of State, who I guess at that point was Tony Blinken, Biden's guy. And now, none of the Senate investigations managed to, or I don't think they asked for, well, where are the minutes of these meetings that were leading up to the demand for Shokin's resignation? That would seem to me to be a really obvious thing to ask for. Bureaucracies work off paper. If there are no minutes, if the interagency committees were demanding Shokin's resignation, it would be in the minutes. And it should be in minutes beginning in October and going through November prior to Joe Biden's demand in the beginning of December. And if it's not in the interagency minutes, then we're dealing with something that's that they're making up after the fact.
Yeah, which wouldn't surprise me, of course. I think there's another kind of item here that needs to be borne in mind, that you have a bunch of bureaucrats who are talking about this guy Shokin needs to be fired. Well, it's really her, but she's blaming it on a bunch of bureaucrats. As you said, where's the paper trail? Where are these minutes and so on? But I think there's something else that we just have to sort of zoom out and sort of just take a look and ask, well, what exactly is it that he did wrong? And we've just gone through these things, and there's nothing demonstrably that he did wrong. And certainly not on some, oh my goodness level where we have to do something about it, or at least we haven't been able to find any such thing. Now, another thing is talking about, say, the Diamond case. Oh, he was delayed, or he wasn't forceful enough with this or that. I mean, you mentioned Durham. Everyone's got those kinds of complaints. I guess we have the same complaints about A.G. Barr. You know, he's been around for 2 years. It's a snake pit, right? When Shokin came in 2015 as the new prosecutor, it wasn't like he had a clean slate where he arrived and he was surrounded by all these wonderful people who, you know, none of them were corrupt and everything was wonderful, and then he was the corrupt one. He was in I think the picture that people don't realize is he was in an office where pretty much everyone was corrupt. So of course you have to pick your battles, just like A.G. Barr has to pick his battles. You can't just, you know, how long did all these Mueller prosecutors, some of them are still there now. You can't just go in and do this and do that. You just have to pick your battles and sort of see it from that side as well. And I don't, certainly not Newland or, you know, any of the narrative from her side took consideration of any of those things. So I just kind of keep coming back to this one point, which is, what is it that Shokin did that's so horrible he had to be removed? And we're not even talking about Biden yet. We're just talking about, you know, as you mentioned, the interagency and these 2 guys who sort of were complaining to the Americans about Shokin. And I don't think we've identified anything. There's nothing there that isn't sort of run of the mill.
Just a quick comment. Fool Nelson, his headphones aren't working, and he just sent me a text that he's listening, but he can't comment. He would like to correct he would like to sort of comment on what we're saying, but he's muted, just as the moderators will be muting Trump on Thursday.
I have speaker, but it's probably not going to sound good, so I'm just going to let you guys go.
Oh, okay.
It's not too bad at all. It's
our muting of Trump didn't work that.
Well, I'm just going to let you guys keep going because I'm not sure how the quality will be.
No, your quality is fine. There's no problem there. But no, so
you guys very well is the problem. But
so we're now in November, and so then Biden suddenly comes in. So he comes in December of 2015.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, there clearly was some sort. There was restlessness within the interagency, whether it's fully documented or not. I think some of it, even a lot of it, is based on misinformation or, sort of not fully understanding what was going on. I mean, certainly the net result, it wasn't as though, looking back over that period, that one can say that Shokin was, worse than the guy before him or worse than the guy after him. In fact, quite the opposite. Certainly on the Burisma file, it was the guy that came after him that settled up with Burisma. It wasn't Shokin. So the attempt to blame Shokin for Burisma just doesn't make any sense.
No, that's right. So then Biden comes in and he wants to. He travels to Ukraine. He meets Poroshenko, the president, and he wants to get rid of Shokin. But Poroshenko doesn't want to get rid of Shokin. I think this is a very important part of the story. So the story, obviously, that Biden told at the security conference, the one that we've all seen the little video clip of, is where he goes in and says, if you don't fire this guy in 6 hours and so on. The actual time frame is more like 3 months. It's not really 6 hours because his first attempt didn't work out. And I think this point is sort of missed, really, where Poroshenko didn't want to get rid of this guy. Poroshenko was actually defending Shokin. So this is sort of weird as well, isn't it? So we keep being told, the media keeps parroting, everyone knew he was corrupt, everyone wanted to get rid of him and so on. But Poroshenko didn't, and Poroshenko is supposedly the good guy, the guy that Biden wanted to work with, and the guy who's going to fix everything over there, and actually the guy that we have the phone call transcripts that were released a few months back. That's Poroshenko, the guy. That's Biden's best buddy, right? So he didn't want to get rid of Poroshenko. Sorry, Poroshenko didn't want to get rid of Shokin. So this is in December.
Well, one other thing in terms of what was going on in this time is that there were demands by the EU and the US that Ukraine set up a anti-corruption investigation unit and a special anti-corruption prosecutor. And the enabling legislation was passed in late 2014, and none of these institutions existed when Shokin came into office in early 2015. By April of that year, April 2015, they'd had competitions to hire the leader of what was called NABU, which is their anti-corruption investigation unit. They set up offices, they hired investigators, and so by August they had 80 investigators, and they were up and running, and that was set up under Shokin's watch. The also had a competition and a selection process to choose a special anti-corruption prosecutor, and this is actually this comes into this timing because in September of 20, they developed a short list, and then they had a committee charged with choosing the new prosecutor, and on the committee there were some people that Shokin had nominated some of the people that were on the committee to choose the new prosecutor. And to the extent that he was representing the sort of the continuing the people, the establishment, if you will, not all of whom was corrupt, but so there was a fierce objection on the part of the activists to Shokin having any nominees on the selection of the anti-corruption prosecutor panel. And they protested like crazy about that around this time. And a lot of in terms of mentality, it would be like AOC objecting to somebody, to Bill Barr. I mean, the analogies aren't exactly precise, but there's a AOC element to the activists, and I don't see any particular reason why every demand of the activists should have been acquiesced to. This was a controversy coming right after the Pyatt speech, and in October, I think the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry was, the Europeans said if you want to have a visa-free program, they had to meet standards on the appointment of the special anti-corruption prosecutor. Shokin refused to get rid of his nominees on the committee. So there was a big schmozzle and fight in late October about the validity of this. However, the short list of candidates that was eventually presented was one that Jeffrey Pyatt thought was a good list. And then they eventually selected Kolodnitsky on November the 30th, and Pyatt said, "This is a good choice. We can get on with things now." And people from the Atlantic Council Atlantic Council starts to rear their ugly head in November as critics of Shokin, and they send some tweets towards Pyatt, getting ready to jump all over the new anti-corruption prosecutor, and Pyatt sends back and says, "No, he's okay. This is good." And so the thugs at Atlantic Council back off, but they'd been criticized. There were a couple. They start writing anti-Shokin editorials in November of 2015, leading up to the somewhat puzzling, Biden taking a position. So there are two editorials that the Atlantic Council wrote against Shokin in November. One was, interestingly enough, when Shokin did make a corruption charge against somebody that was in the one of the parties of Kolomoisky, a oligarch that was supported by the Atlantic Council. And so when he filed corruption against somebody associated with an Atlantic Council associated oligarch, they said that was politically motivated, and that they objected to that. But they sort of backed off when Pyatt said that the new guy was okay, and then closed it. And Pyatt, so all of this dispute over the makeup of the committee selecting the new guy more or less became moot when the selection was approved by U.S. State Department and the Europeans.
Right. And then, notwithstanding that, Biden goes in December. He wants to get rid of Shokin. Poroshenko says, no, he's a good guy.
Yep.
There's no problem there. And then we've got the Pyatt tweet, his sort of New Year's tweet. So Pyatt, just to reminder for everyone, that's the ambassador over there. So his New Year's tweet is, and this is the same guy who gave that excoriating speech back in September, where he said, you guys need to fix things and so on. And the tweet is actually sort of very encouraging. It says, well, we've made a lot of progress, things looking much better now, that sort of thing. So that's in the beginning of January. So Poroshenko sort of fobbed off Biden. No, we're not going to fire that guy. Pyatt says things are getting better. Of course, we don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he was sort of just trying to keep up appearances or whatever.
I can't hear you.
See, mine have now cut out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you've gone faint.
Okay. Now
Stay close to
we
your
skip
computer.
to the White House, the Ukrainians visiting the White House in January.
Okay, Hans, let me step in there.
I can hear Hans faintly.
You can? Maybe we should let's cut this. Let's cut this and get a new connection.
What? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Hans.
Okay. So we're
okay. Just Hans. Let's go back 2 weeks, because in the middle of December. So Biden goes over to Ukraine in the first week of. Oh, look, we skipped over a seminal issue in this. Biden's going over to Ukraine in the first week of December, and on December 7th, just in the midst of Biden going over and getting a hero's welcome in Ukraine, the New York Times publishes a very negative article about Hunter Biden and Burisma, which had raised a few eyebrows in 2014 when first announced, but this was a big New York Times story about Hunter and his dealing with a pretty questionable company. So this, I mean, I'm sure that Joe would have been wild about this article. And one of the things that I wonder about is whether his his reaction to Shokin in early December seems disproportionate to whatever provocation Shokin had. And at the same time, Leshchenko, who is a activist MP in Ukraine, had visited Biden's office in Washington just before the trip, and he reported in an article in December that they were just wild within everybody in Biden's office wanted to hang Shokin. I mean, he'd become the devil for them. So I wonder to some extent, I wonder whether they viewed Shokin as somehow being connected to this New York Times hit article on Hunter. Otherwise, it's just hard to explain why, why Shokin and, why he would have gone that far into the weeds. Anyway, but going forward, which is important, on December 18th, and this was a PDF that Nelson located. The U.S. State Department sends an invitation to the sort of the disloyal deputy prosecutors and the new anti-corruption prosecutor to come to the States for a visit. They don't invite Shokin. So they invite Kolodnitsky, the new anti-corruption prosecutor, they invite Casco, and they invite Sakvarilidze. Shokin doesn't let Casco go. And so just he by this time there's obviously a huge amount of infighting between the two of them. He perceives Casco as a viper within his company, and I think in terms of the State Department, I mean, I don't know what, regardless of what they thought of how the prosecutor's office was working, I mean, their correct form of invitation should have been to invite the junior people through the boss of the agency. I mean, Shokin should have been, the invitation should have gone to Shokin, and they could have suggested that those were the guys they wanted, but to do it behind Shokin's back was a sort of a provocation by the State Department that was going to simply ratchet up tensions. So anyway, you described what happens in January because it's cool.
Yeah, but Fool, do you want to pick up on the Ciaramella meeting and all that happened?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So basically, Sakvarilidze, then the SAP, Nazar Kolodnitsky, Artem Sitnik, the leader Nabu, they're all invited to this meeting on January 19th, 2016. And this turns out to be one of the more famous meetings where Eric Ciaramella is the lead there. And Liz Zentos attends that meeting as well. And they all meet also Andrei Teleshenko, who turns out to be the sort of the whistleblower in all of this. But part of that meeting is that, first of all, this is according to Andrei, that they want to look at people, U.S. citizens that are associated with the party of regions, which would be Paul Manafort. But they also mention that this Burisma prosecution is problematic. I'm not sure if Hunter Biden was mentioned, but according to Andrei Teleshenko, this Burisma sort of topic came up, and that they're not happy with the prosecution, and mainly that they're not happy with Shokin. I guess they're kind of implying. If you guys want to comment on that, but yeah. after that meeting, that party goes and meets with the FBI, with Karen Greenaway, who's running the Manafort operation, and then they eventually leave Washington, and then in February, or Hans, do you want to go from there?
Well, let's just check that one new date. The EC opening the Manafort investigation was dated on January 13th. So it was just like the week before they had the meeting with the Ukrainians. They opened, right. They formally opened the investigation into Manafort, presumably based on sort of responding to wishes of Chalupa, who was a pal of Ciaramella. And Sitnik Sitnik, who is one of the people at this meeting, who is later is a person who produces the questionable black ledger that took Manafort down in the summertime, and there are questions about Sitnik's role in that, but he was clearly the January meeting with Ciaramella is clearly connected to the later delivery of the black ledger.
Right, which I'm wondering if the Black Ledger was already around before that meeting or before the opening of the Manafort case, because Karen Greenaway, who's the leader of that, the supervising agent of the Manafort case at that time, has this relationship with ANTAC, the Anti-Corruption Center or whatever of Ukraine, which is funded by Soros, and they're kind of working with Chalupa, but Karen Greenaway has this relationship, and all of a sudden, I'm assuming probably at that point, this ledger pops up, which they're looking at and saying, oh, this isn't looking good. Karen Greenaway gets a hold of it potentially at that point, and they just decided to open up the Manafort case again, which had been shut down like in 2014, I believe. But going forward from there, they tell the prosecutors, or what's that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I mean, there are a lot of questions about the validity of the Black Ledger.
Oh yeah, I mean it's thought to be a fake now, but it's something that added to the investigation at the time, I would believe.
Okay, right after the earliest that I could date the linkage of the $1 billion loan to the firing of Shokin is the Chiaramella meeting. And because right after that, there's a sequence which we knew about before, but it was the earlier context that we didn't have. There are articles in Ukrainian language press right now reporting that the firing of Shokin is going to be the price of the next tranche from the IMF, and then a couple of weeks later, the Davos meeting. There's a Davos meeting at which Biden and Poroshenko and the IMF would be at, and then in early February, the IMF comes on board to the firing of Shokin and the next tranche. But it's very unclear that it certainly that linkage doesn't seem to have originated with the IMF. It clearly seems to have originated with the Biden group in the Biden and Chiaramella.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think this is another important point where, again, the media keeps parroting, everyone wants to get rid of this guy. But I think, as we've shown, that's not true. And the press release we did find was the February press release where the IMF, and it doesn't even say get rid of Shokin or whatever. It talks in generalities about corruption in Ukraine. So it's almost as if that was sort of a made-to-order press release where the Biden people leaned on Lagarde or whoever at the IMF to say, look, we need to ratchet up the pressure with these guys. Can you put something out there? The other things that happened after the Chiaramella meeting, which is, again, really important. In early February, the owner of Burisma had his property seized in Ukraine. So houses, cars, things like that. Again, that is sort of runs contrary to this, what the Biden people have put out there and what the media keeps saying, that somehow Shokin had to be fired because he wasn't going after Burisma. Again, it's what we talked about earlier, the accusing your enemies of what you're guilty of. It's the exact opposite. Shokin was. And so we've verified this. So there are contemporaneous news reports on this, and we've verified. We've gone to archive.org, and it's really there. So don't quote me, but this is early February in 2016. This really happened. So Shokin went in and seized a whole bunch of things that belonged to the owner of Burisma. So of course that would have been big time alarm bells. And then another thing happened in mid-February around the same time, which is that the Latvian government was also investigating Burisma as well as Hunter Biden personally. At least he's mentioned by name in the document that announced this investigation. And so the Latvian government sought help from the Ukrainian government in pursuing this investigation. So this was in relation to financial crimes. Now, Latvia isn't like Ukraine. Latvia is an EU member. Latvia is a fairly normal country, or whatever you want to call it. We've had a very close look at the guy who was in charge of the Latvian investigations, a guy called Burkans. There's absolutely nothing to suggest that there's anything fishy about that guy at all. So I think he's retired now. He did that job for 20 years. Bad reports. There's nothing at all about this guy. So we just have to assume that what happened on the Latvian side was totally legit. What probably happened is that, well, there's very little sort of in terms of documentation. There is I don't know what you want to call it. It's not an indictment. It's sort of it's a Latvian a document that's out there. I think we have it on our Twitters, and it's sort of been shared around, that describes sort of in outline what's going on. So certain transactions were flagged up, probably because they were going through a Latvian bank or through Latvia, and that's how they got to pinpoint Burisma and Hunter Biden. So you have the Latvian people looking into Hunter and Burisma. They send this notice to Ukraine to ask for assistance. At the same time, the Burisma owner has his house and his cars and all that seized. So obviously, this is alarm bells ringing, high time to do something, which then leads us into, this is happening at the same time as these demands are sort of ratcheting up for this guy to go, as well as you said, the tying in of the 1 billion with this guy, with getting rid of this guy. But then it still took a few more weeks to get rid of him, because he was only finally gotten rid of in March.
Let me just mention another sort of other events in February at this time. That's when Blue Star really starts ratcheting up their contacts.
Right.
And so
right, yeah.
From the FOIA information, there's a Hunter, in late January, Hunter contacts Tony Blinken, who's the Deputy Secretary of State at that time and is now on the Biden campaign. And we don't know what Hunter and him talked about. In February, Sally, I forget whether it was Sally Painter or Karen Tramontano of Blue Star, sought a meeting with Catherine Novelli, who was a senior State Department official, to lobby her on behalf of Burisma. And they are, there's a bunch of exchanges where she tries to get briefed on what's happening with Burisma, but clearly Burisma is doing what they can. They're reacting. As the pressure is being, as they're getting squeezed by Shokin, they are ratcheting up their representation through Blue Star and Hunter in the United States.
Right. Yeah.
So that timing works.
And so then that leads to and I'm not sure we're clear exactly how that happened, whether it was a phone call or how exactly Biden. We know his story, the one he told at that security conference.
The corn pop type story.
That's right. It was a corn pop type story, but he pulled the trigger. So Biden finally pulled the trigger in March. I don't think we have.
Well, Hans, before March happens, there's a story about that. It comes out that apparently Shokin submits his letter of resignation, or that Poroshenko demands it on February 16th, I believe, or something like that. But it comes out later that it was actually not a letter of resignation. It was just that he was going to take a leave of absence. And then on February 18th, Biden and Poroshenko are on the phone, and Poroshenko says that, hey, I got that problem taken care of for you, even though he didn't. There's no allegation of him doing anything wrong or being corrupt. Viktor Shokin has resigned. I asked for his resignation. And then it goes, and that's not exactly true. And then March happens, and then go on from there, I guess.
Okay, my take on that sequence is it appears that Poroshenko, in effect, asked Shokin to resign as a favor. That
Right.
He just said, look, we're we need you to resign to get this money. Will you do it? And no, I'm not saying he did anything wrong, but for the greater good, for the good of the country, will you do it? So Shokin seems to, yeah. I mean, he I guess he told Poroshenko that he resigned, and then he went on holiday. Then he kind of left the office, and then said that, well, I'm just on a leave of absence. He kind of had second thoughts about doing so, perhaps because I guess it was being represented as an admission of corruption on his part, and he probably, he certainly wasn't, he certainly didn't acknowledge that and didn't think he'd done anything corrupt, and he probably hadn't, and that would so he then refused to resign under the impression that he was resigning as an admission of corruption. And then he was still in office at the end of March, and at that time Poroshenko is scheduled to come to Washington, and interestingly enough, the Vadim Pozharsky, the number 2 guy at Burisma, is also in Washington at the end of March. So sort of all the players are in Washington at this time, and then at that point, Poroshenko gets a resolution from Parliament terminating Shokin, and he's out. But his last act before being terminated was he fired Saakashvili, the Georgian guy that had been disloyal to him, and he wasn't rehired in the new by the replacement prosecutor, and within a few months all the other Georgians were out of their jobs as well.
Right. Yeah. Let me just then try and kind of wrap it up, because now Shokin's gone and he's replaced by a guy called Lutsenko. So this is different from the Leshenko guy. That's the one that Steve mentioned earlier. That's that activist MP. So new guy comes in, Lutsenko. That's the guy. That's basically Biden's pick. So what's interesting about this guy is that he does actually wind up all these investigations against Burisma. So he actually does what basically the Bidens wanted him to do. And it all culminates right before Trump becomes president. So in January 2017, all the investigations, everything is wound up, everything is killed off. And then kind of, I guess as a celebratory visit or whatever, it's always struck me as so odd that literally a few days, just a couple of days before the handover on January 20th, Biden's in Ukraine. And investigations are done. No more trouble for Burisma. And well, at that point, it's a bit after, Zlochevsky, the boss, is able to he had been basically in sort of exile. He was able to go back, and no more problems. And it was this guy. And this is again. Everyone complains about Shokin, and supposedly Shokin didn't investigate or whatever. Well, it's Shokin's successor, Lutsenko, who wound it up. He actually wound up the investigations. He did what I guess was expected of him. And again, if we sort of, there's a lot of detail in what we discussed here and so on, but if we kind of do the 30,000-foot view, if we kind of zoom out and look at this, I think what everyone has to just bear in mind in a very complex story is what are the basic elements of it? Well, the basic element is that you've got this guy, Biden, who goes and tells another country what prosecutor to fire or hire. And I think as we discussed at the outset, how weird would that be, and what would the outcry be if Mike Pence went to some country, as you mentioned earlier, goes to Canada and said, "You got to fire your attorney general," whatever? It'd be a huge outcry. And now add into that equation that the son of Mike Pence, or Trump's son, or whatever, if it's Trump asking the favor, is involved or has some issue with that guy. And clearly he did, because as we know, he had actually, we confirmed this absolutely, that he had seized the Burisma owner's property. So if we look at it from that point of view, and then add into that the replacement that Biden got in, this guy Lutsenko, actually gets rid of these investigations. So we have all the elements there for something untoward having happened there. Now, we may not be able to fully pinpoint Nuland's role and how it is when we came up with some possible explanations as to why Casco and the Georgian guy, they had their own motivations for pestering Nuland about Shokin. There's many elements of the story, but I think at the core of it, we have the Vice President of the United States going to another country and telling them what to do with one of their prosecutors, and then in the end, it happens that the Vice President of the United States gets his way, makes his son happy, makes his son's boss very happy. The prosecutor is replaced with a guy who makes all the problems go away. I mean, that at its core is what it is. And that's a pretty bad story, and certainly one that is worth investigating very, very thoroughly.
With the added element that the Democrat media then blame the whole thing on the one innocent guy.
Yeah, the one who actually asked for that investigation. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that like we've said before, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of real corruption by Viktor Shokin, and Poroshenko even says that to Biden straight up on the 18th. But as we're getting these Hunter Biden emails, it's kind of apparent that obviously Burisma hired Hunter Biden because they wanted these investigations to go away. Hunter Biden uses influence with his father to make these investigations go away. And what we're learning is that basically, since Joe Biden gets 50% of Hunter Biden's cut, Burisma probably paid Joe Biden directly just to get this problem to go away, which is a clear conflict of interest and abuse of power, and probably illegal.
Oh, most certainly, especially since the 1 billion was involved, which is of course part of the government. I think it was a loan guarantee. I don't think it was actually 1 billion of U.S. taxpayer money. But either way, I mean, if the loan is defaulted on, it is. So that's essentially. It's not essentially. I mean, it is literally selling the foreign policy of the United States for your own personal profit.
Yep.
Today's installment.
And that's just the Ukraine part.
Not. Stay tuned for China, Romania, Kazakhstan. But I think we've covered it pretty well in this installment of Fool's Gold, I guess, with Hans and Steve. Steve, you have anything else to add?
No, I'm bored out.
All right. Well, thank you guys, and we'll talk to everybody next time.
Okay, bye.
Thanks. See you.
All right. See you, man.